Hi everybody, thanks for joining my session, A Cloud Voice with Microsoft Teams. You're with Damien Margaritis. Now before we start, we'll get through a few of the T's and C's. So first up, traditional owners are welcome to our speakers and participants from around the world. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of what the online conference is hosted and the traditional custodians of the land where our Australian-based speakers and participants are located. We'd also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and future. So a little bit on code of conduct. So we want to be constructive, respectful and be helpful and be kind. I won't go through that in detail. You can go to the Microsoft365may.com code of conduct section if you want to read about this a little bit more. Okay. Let's get into it. Thanks to our sponsors regarding 365, Swoop, AvePoint, Valo, all the rest there. So I urge you to go and check out what they do in the Microsoft 365 space. That's me. My name is Damien Margaritis. I'm based in Melbourne, Victoria. Contact details here. We'll be sharing this content at some point, I would imagine, after these sessions. So if you want to get in touch, that's how you can reach me. If you happen to be in Brisbane or Melbourne, I am involved in Skype and Teams user groups in both locations. They're actually being held remotely these days, so you could be anywhere and join. So please come along. Okay, so first a little bit of history. So what we're talking about today is calling with Teams. But before we jump into that, I just want to touch on where we've come from. So if we go back all the way to Office Communication Server 2007, we actually had the ability to do what Microsoft call enterprise voice back then. And back then we had to have what we call a session border controller, or an SBC for short, and a connection to a phone, to a telco provider, usually via ISDN back then. But it allowed us to have our Office communication client and use that to make phone calls as well as communicating with people, OCS client to OCS client and whatnot. Moving forward, we of course moved into Link around 2010, and Link 2010, very much the same model. We had a session border controller that integrated with our Link server environment, and it gave us the dial pad within Link. And this is when I really got involved with Microsoft Voice, and I would say this was really a tipping point where we really started to see voice take off within the Microsoft environment. And there's our Link client there. Of course, after Microsoft brought Skype for Business, we had a very similar scenario. We had gateways on site, or SBCs, phone lines, some servers, and now we had the telephone button within Skype for Business. So by this point, not a hell of a lot had changed. The clients had changed, some additional capabilities around what we could do with call routing and things like that, but everything was more or less the same. Move forward a little bit further, of course, we get Skype for Business Online. And this was introduced not too long after Skype for Business server came along. And with that, we actually had this new capability where we could actually move some or all of our users to Skype for Business Online. And we could actually hop off through our on-premises infrastructure to get access to phone lines or any other on-premises telephony infrastructure, which was nice to have. So this was kind of where we got to with Skype for Business server and moving users to Skype for Business Online. This is a kind of infrastructure that we would use. But we had plenty of organizations that started to move to Skype for Business Online and wanted to do voice and didn't really want to have a full Skype for Business server infrastructure on premises to support that. So there was something else that came along, something called Cloud Connector Edition, which basically allowed us to deploy a subset of Skype for Business servers on-prem that would allow us to light up telephony in the cloud. So think of that as a bit of plumbing that we would deploy in order to support voice in Skype for Business Online using on-premises infrastructure. So at this point, I still had a reliance on having some equipment deployed somewhere, right? I needed it in my data center or someone else's data center. I needed something deployed on-premises. So of course, since then, we've now moved into Microsoft Teams. So we saw Teams launch in March 2017. And at the time, it was really touted as that collaboration platform that Microsoft was releasing. we should make that differentiation as well. So Skype for Business was a communications platform. It was a bunch of communication tools, instant message and presence, conferencing and telephony. Teams kind of took it a bit further, and now we have this concept of collaboration. So when I explain collaboration in Teams to people, I talk about the Teams button in Teams, or co-authoring documents, or any of the other things that we can do within Teams that aren't necessarily related to the communication stack that we might have been used to with Skype for Business. So Microsoft Teams, probably seen this slide a few times if you've been to any Microsoft events, but it is the hub for teamwork in Office 365. Sometimes referred to within Microsoft as the Meta OS, that we're going to see more and more tools kind of be exposed within this platform. So rather than seeing applications released out of band of Teams that appear on your desktop, we start to see them natively appear within the Teams client. So of course, it only makes sense that we can also have calling capabilities within the Teams client. So this is possible today. This allows us to have all-in-one communication, making sure that we have all our communication and collaboration tools in one location. Everybody gets a calling button, regardless of whether we have PSTN calling in Teams. So even if you haven't taken additional steps that we're going to go through in this session today to light up telephony in Teams or PSTN access, you'll notice that there's still a calls button in the Teams client. People can click on that and they can go and search for somebody's name and they can make a phone call to someone over Teams. What we're going to talk about today is how do we add the dial pad to that location? How do we add the dial pad so that we can actually talk to the PSTN network as well? So first up, how do we actually get Teams Cloud Voice? So there's a few components that we need, and there's a decision to be made as well about which way we go about it. So first up, of course, if I want to support voice in Teams, I need an Office 365 tenant. I need Microsoft Teams, which exists in Office 365. On top of that, I also need a license. This is Microsoft Phone System License. It used to be called Cloud PBX once upon a time, but this is a licensing component that you need in order to light up the dial pad within the Teams client. So think of it as a mini little phone system per person when you give them that license. This license is part of E5 and A5 and an add-on license for the E1, E3 suites and so forth. So I need to have that phone system license in order to light up the dial pad. But once I've got that dial pad capability, I'm still not plugged into the PSTN network. I still need a phone line if you like. And there are two ways to do that with Microsoft Teams. In Australia, we have something called Telstra calling for Office 365. In other parts of the world, this is a Microsoft calling service. It is not a Telstra service. Japan also has a service from a third party as well. And then we have this concept of Telstra calling plans. So I have my phone system license. I talk to Telstra. I say I want PSTN calling. I then get a Telstra calling plan that is associated with my users, similar to a license, just like we license the user for phone system. And that's how I get access to the phone network. Alternatively, I also have this other technology called direct routing for Teams. Direct routing for Teams is another alternative to get voice into my Microsoft Teams environment. And we're going to go through this in more detail about how this works. So direct routing and calling plans. So at the moment, there are 12 countries that have calling plans available, of which Australia is, of course, one. US, UK, Canada, Netherlands, Germany, they're all listed on that diagram there. If you like, there is actually a link at the bottom of this slide that is a link to a spreadsheet that has all of the countries and who has what capabilities today. With direct routing, basically I can do direct routing wherever I want. I can have direct routing from my own data center. I can have it from Azure. We're going to cover this in more detail. But in locations where I don't have direct routing, calling plans available, I can use direct routing and I can mix and match. I'm not necessarily limited to one technology or the other. And we're going to go through more of that shortly. So first up, Telstra calling for Office 365. What is it? Telstra calling is native PSTN calling from Office 365 in Australia. It's supported with both Skype for Business Online and Microsoft Teams. This is a differentiator. Now, Skype for Business Online is disappearing next year, middle of next year. But today, if I still have users on Skype for Business, maybe I'm using Skype for Business Online and I'm transitioning to Teams, but I'm not quite there yet. I can actually use Telstra calling for Skype for Business Online. It provides simplified number management directly from the Office 365 admin portal. So I can go to the portal, I can see my phone numbers, I can associate them to users and whatnot. So it is all in one spot. No on-premises telephony infrastructure required. And in other regions, as I mentioned earlier, it is known as a Microsoft calling service or Microsoft calling plan. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at global deployments. From an architecture perspective, not a lot to show. We have Office 365 in the middle there. We have Telstra in Australia, or Microsoft with calling plans sitting behind Office 365 to the right there. And then on the other side, I have my users that could be on a PC, could be on a phone, could be on a touch device of some sort, but they're able to access the PSTN network via Office 365 out to PSTN. Okay. So components, what do I need? So first up, of course, I need an Office 365 tenant. I then need to be licensed for phone system. So that is included in E5, or it is an add-on for E1, E3, or the similar A licenses for academic. The phone system is an add-on license for those packs. I then need a Telstra calling plan. And once I have those three things, I have a happy user that's using a very old mobile phone that is able to make and receive calls through Teams or Skype for Business using the Telstra calling plan. I have seen a couple of questions come through to the list. I will get to the questions after this first section. So I have a few breaks where I stop to answer some of the questions coming through. So please be aware that I will get to those. So this is how, these are the components for Telstra calling for Office 365. Some of the pros and cons. So pros, to fully cloud hosted solution, no on-premises infrastructure, support to voice for both Skype for Business Online and Microsoft Teams clients. Cons, limited migration support. So it's a cloud-based service. We're going to touch on this a little bit more when we talk about direct routing, but I have limited options when it comes to things like single number migration over time or things like that. Lack of third-party integration, again, kind of to that first con point there. If I need to bring in some, standard SIP help points or standard SIP intercom systems, how do I interface those with the cloud or with Telstra calling? I actually have to use some additional technology to make that work, and we're going to cover that as well. It is a Telstra offering only, so there are other telcos that are doing things with direct routing that we'll get to in a sec, but for the time being, this kind of native service within Office 365 is a Telstra offering only. Must choose one calling plan type for all users. So Telstra have a number of different calling plans for users, from cheaper to more expensive. That includes the types of calls that users are going to make. So for example, there's a mid plan that includes free calls and local calls, but charges per minute for mobile and international. And then there's a top end plan that includes everything except international. I have to pick one plan for all of my users. I can't pick, for 80% of my users, you have the low plan, and for 20% of my users, we have the more expensive plan. I have to pick one for everybody. Okay? And it is a per user licensing model. So when I get those calling plans for my users, if I have 100 users, I need 100 calling plans. If I have 1,000 users, I need 1,000 calling plans. I can't separate out how many trunks or channels, if you like, of calling plan I have from my users. It is a per user licensing model. Okay, now we're going to talk about direct routing. So direct routing, in a nutshell, it's a SIP trunk. It just happens to go over the internet. Okay, it is a secure SIP trunk between a session border controller, a telephony device, and Office 365. It allows an organisation to connect their telephony infrastructure directly to Office 365. Various deployment models we're going to cover off on today. Adds additional flexibility to Microsoft Teams voice environments. Can be used with Teams only mode. That's a key differentiator there from Telstra calling, in that I can only use direct routing with Microsoft Teams. I cannot use it for my Skype for Business Online users. How does it work? Okay, so first up we have a PSTN provider, and that PSTN provider could be your SIP trunk or even your ISDN trunk in your data center in your office. It could be a SIP trunk over the internet. Organisations like MyNetPhone, telcos, they have SIP trunks that we can get over the internet. So we have a PSTN provider who provides us with a SIP trunk that plugs into our session border controller, which has another SIP trunk, which is our direct route that connects to phone system in Office 365. And that's how I get calling into my users, to and from my users. With that session border controller, some of the additional capabilities that I can support, and this is one of the main differentiators between Telstra calling and direct routing, is that I can also interface with third-party PBX systems, analog telephony adapters, third-party contact centers, pretty much anything I want to interface with. So for example, I've done some deployment work for customers where everybody's on Microsoft Teams for voice, they're using direct routing, but we've still got a PA system that we need to interface with. And they also had a gate system where they press a button, it hits the session border controller here, the call actually hits the session border controller, routes over the internet to Teams users. They can speak to the person at the intercom and dial a code and the door unlocks, things like that. It's quite flexible. Okay, so components, of course, we need an Office 365 tenant. We still need the same licensing that we needed with Telstra calling. The difference here is though that instead of a calling plan, I now have to have a session border controller configured somewhere for direct routing. Okay, so rather than have a per user licensing model for calls with direct routing, I could have, say, a 10 SIP trunk with my SIP trunk provider or my existing provider today, and I configure a session border controller to interface with that, and then that's how I get my calls into and out of my environment. So I don't have that additional licensing component of a calling plan when I deploy direct routing. And there we go. So pros and cons. Pros, I can use existing SBCs, little star on that. There is a list of certified SBCs. More often than not, if you have an existing Sky for Business environment, you already have an SBC that's certified. We're going to touch on that a little bit later when we go through some scenarios. I can add it to existing deployments, as I just mentioned. Single number migration, I can do things like that. You know, I can get direct routing into an environment. I can start moving 1, 2, 3, 10 users out of a 100 number range at a time. I don't have to move entire number ranges to the cloud like I might have to do with Telstra calling. Support for third-party scenarios we touched on. You can keep using your existing telco. So this is another scenario we come across sometimes. There might be every intention for an organisation that wants to use the simplicity of Telstra calling. It all makes sense, but they've still got a 3-year agreement with their current telco provider. So they need to see that out. So direct routing lets you keep using that service. Yeah. No additional per user license. We buy SIP channels instead, and I can use it anywhere. Right. So direct routing, calling plans in 12 countries around the world. Direct routing I can use anywhere in the world. Cons, additional management overhead. So if I've got some infrastructure somewhere I need to support for calling, if I need to have telco agreements and whatnot, there might be some additional things, additional management that I need to take into account. Okay, looking at some deployment models. So if I have my own data center in my business, and just to answer that last question that came in because it's relevant, someone's actually asked, what is an SBC? And it's a great question. So an SBC, or a session border controller, is a bit of equipment that acts as a proxy between, say, your telco and your phone system. So often we see them at the perimeter of the network. Think of it like a firewall device, but for voice. So if I want to route calls between a telco provider and my Sky for Business environment, my Teams environment, my Cisco environment, anything like that, there's usually a device, a session border controller that sits in the middle that basically orchestrates that. So that's what an SBC is. So in a hosted on-premises solution like this, pretty straightforward. I have that SBC hosted on-prem in my data center, and I set up a direct route to Microsoft Teams. That direct route happens over the internet. We use a public IP address that's associated with that device, and we're able to get calls routing to my Teams users and also my Teams meeting rooms. And that's also important to point out. If you've invested in Microsoft Teams Room System or Surface Hub, then you can also use direct routing to get the phone button to appear on those devices. Okay. You can actually host direct routing now in Azure. So now we have this concept of virtual SBCs from companies like Ribbon and AnyNode and Audio Codes. I can actually deploy their virtual SBC into Azure, so I don't need to install it in my data center or in my on-premises environment. And we get a SIP trunk from our provider that happens over the internet. The direct route happens between Azure and Teams, which is great because they're both really close to each other and we get really good network connectivity. And my internal users or my internal Microsoft Teams Room devices actually get access to a telephony network through Azure. So that's another supported model. Okay. These virtual SBCs have been around for a little while, but it's only been relatively recent that we've had virtual SBCs in Azure. And the last model is what we call carrier hosted. So I've seen some questions come up around, do Optus offer an Office plan or some other plan for calling, given that Telstra Calling has Telstra Calling for Office 365. So there is actually a model for direct routing where the carrier hosts that infrastructure for you, and you pay dollars per user or dollars per concurrent channel of calls, and they provide the direct route into Teams for you. So it's another option that you can look at if you don't want to have any hosted infrastructure at all, whether it be in your data centers or in Azure. So this is the carrier hosted model for direct routing. Okay, so direct routing deployment models. So from the carrier hosted perspective, one thing that has changed, or what we can now do with direct routing, is these carriers can basically have direct routes going to multiple tenants. So you imagine a carrier will have like a big, beefy SBC environment that they stand up. It'll be highly available and whatnot, and then they're able to offer this service to multiple customers. So we start to get economies of scale. So for you as a customer or an end user, when would I use direct routing? So first up in this example, this is, I guess, a greenfield deployment. We don't have any telephony, or we're deploying side by side. And I can just get that session border controller into my environment and have a trunk going to my telco. And then it talks to Teams and talks to my Teams users. So pretty straightforward. But what if I don't have that? What if I have any other PABX on the planet? All right, so Avaya, Cisco, NEC, insert any other type of platform that you like. So one really common way that we get these deployed is that we put our certified session border controller in line like that. And from there, we can actually configure that direct route out to Teams and support my Microsoft Teams devices and users. Just to call this out as well, this is a very common scenario that we do first for customers that may have invested in either Surface Hub and or Microsoft Teams Room systems, and they want to be able to light up the telephone button on their devices. So even if they have no intention at this stage of moving any of their voice or end users to Microsoft Teams Voice, at the very least, adding that session border controller and that direct route to their environment allows us to pull off individual numbers and light up that call button on my Microsoft Teams Room system or Surface Hub. I think this is really valuable if you're, spending money on kitting out video conference rooms or on Surface Hubs. I want those devices to be able to make phone calls as well. I don't want to be in a situation where I have this device, Microsoft Teams Room device, sitting in a room, and I still need to have a phone sitting next to it in order to make and receive direct in-dial calls. It's also a blocker for your users, right? If they just want to call somebody into a meeting by calling their mobile number or something like that, having direct route in the mix means that they can actually do it. So for customers that have an existing Sky for Business server environment, chances are they actually have a session border controller already that is supported. So all of the major session border controllers that we used with Link and Sky for Business from companies like Audio Codes and Sonus, which is now Ribbon, and other organizations, they are supported for use with direct routing. So if you're lucky enough to be an existing Sky for Business server environment, but you want to start moving some users to Teams Voice, relatively straightforward for us to add the direct route to that device. And now we've got a mechanism to move to move users between those two worlds, and they can take their phone number with them. And we do this pretty much for all of our customers, all of the organisations that I work with that have Sky for Business server today. And this also goes for anyone that invested in Sky for Business Cloud Connector Edition. So they didn't have a big Sky for Business server environment. They deployed Cloud Connector Edition so they could light up voice for Sky for Business Online users. It's the same logic though. We add direct route that connects to the cloud, to Microsoft Teams like that. And then we can move users from Sky for Business Online voice to Microsoft Teams voice, and it'll be fully supported. Cool. Okay, just a little bit on these two technologies as well. This is important to call out. So direct routing and Telstra calling can work together as well. It can add flexibility to Telstra calling. And what do I mean by that? So these two call routing methods, or ways that we get voice into the cloud, are not mutually exclusive. I can use them at the same time. I may want to use direct routing to support migration to Telstra calling. So essentially use it as a migration mechanism. I'll go through some of those scenarios as well. And I actually have a choice of routing methods. So to make this a little bit clearer, let's just work through an example. So let's say I've got a Teams user, and my Teams user calls a mobile number in Australia. That call, I want to use Telstra calling to support that call, and we can get that call out to the PSTN network. Pretty straightforward. But what if that same user dials a specific number, and maybe that number exists on an internal phone system or a call center application or something like that within my environment? Well, what I can do is I can actually selectively grab that number and say, no, don't use Telstra calling. I want you to use direct routing. And I can route it to that session border controller. I can route it to third-party PBX or an analog device if I really want, but I can use these two technologies together. And on the choice of routing methods, what I just showed you was the route based on dial pattern. Okay, but basically what that means is that I'm making a decision about which service I use based on the number that's being dialed. I could also have some of my users that always use Telstra calling and some of my users that always use direct routing. And that's a really common scenario. Say, for example, customers of mine or organisations that I work with that have Telstra calling in Australia, but they're using direct routing in other countries, okay? Because they don't have an option to use a calling plan in that country. Cool. Another reason why we might use direct routing and Telstra calling together, I might want to hop through direct routing to get to Telstra calling, okay? So maybe I want to support single number migration and I want to remove cutover risk. When I cut over to my number ranges to Telstra calling, I essentially, usually I have to move my 100 number ranges at a time. So if I've got an office of 100 people and they've got a 100 number range, I have to move that to Telstra calling in one hit. So big bang approach, if you like. I might not want to do that. I might want to have a mechanism in place where I can move individual numbers out of that range over time. I can support that with direct routing. So here we have a PABX environment that we want to move eventually to Telstra calling, but we want to do it over time. So here, similar to what I showed you before, we put that session border controller in the mix and we integrate it with Teams in Office 365. And then I've actually, once I'm ready, once I've actually moved all of my PABX users to Teams, my number range gets ported up to the cloud, and then I can decommission all of my on-premises infrastructure. So nice and tidy. And just a quick aside, just want to talk a little bit about dialing conferencing. So this is particularly pertinent for anyone that's coming from Sky for Business on premises or Link, dare I say. But if you came from on-prem Skype or Link server environments, chances are you may have been using dial-in conferencing from your Sky for Business server environment. When you move to the cloud, you actually need the Microsoft audio conferencing license to support dial-in conferencing out of Office 365. You cannot use your on-premises Sky for Business servers or Link servers to support dial-in conferencing when you move users to the cloud. So the phone system license that we already talked about, that's for PSTN calling only. It's not for dial-in conferencing. It's an additional license that is part of E5, and an add-on for E1 or E3. So just keep that in mind. If you're moving from on-prem Skype for Business and you're moving to the cloud, you don't usually just need phone system license, you also need audio conferencing license. So as an example, here's my meeting invite that pops up in Outlook when I create a Teams meeting, and that's the phone number that I get, which is in the Microsoft or the Office 365 cloud. It's not on-prem, it's not on a SIP trunk or anything like that. And I also have the ability to get access to a whole bunch of numbers from around the world that I can call to get access to my meeting. And that's included with the license. If these are all toll numbers, so if I have audio conferencing license and someone hits that find a local number and they scroll down to, Athens, Greece, I'm not sure if that's there or not, but they scroll down and call that number, they put the conference ID in, it doesn't cost you anything else. They're just paying their local call rates where they are. There are options for toll-free numbers, and you can get communications credits from Microsoft to support that. So if you do want a 1-800 number in Australia, you can do that as well. Okay, now before I move on to calling features, I'm just going to scroll through some of the questions that are here. So one of the first questions here, which of the two PSTN dial tone options is most cost-effective or cheapest? Hard to say. It really depends on your scenario. It depends on how many users, depends on what infrastructure is being used. There is quite a bit that goes into figuring that out. So it really depends on your scenario. So if you want to get in touch with me and look into that a little bit more, happy to take you through it, and I can give you the rundown on how we actually do the math. Another question here, for non-Telstra providers, do Microsoft certify these providers? Just noticed a few more providers offering the service. So what Microsoft do certify is the session border controller, or that device that is being used on the direct route. So as long as they're using a certified device, then that's where Microsoft's certification ends, as far as I'm aware. So what these telcos are doing, they're using the carrier model SBC deployment that Microsoft has made available and promotes. So as long as they're using certified infrastructure, then that shouldn't be a problem. Will the presentation be available afterwards? Let me have a chat to the Strants who have organised this fantastic event, and I'll find out what's happening with the slide decks. If they're going to be shared, I'm sure that it'll be made public. So another question here, for a provider like Arkin and NTT, I'm assuming they use direct routing. You would be correct. So if they are not Telstra in Australia, then they are using direct routing to offer their service. Who might be a carrier network that we could use? There's a lot out there. So if you're talking about direct routing, you can pretty much use any carrier you want. There's no real limitation as to what SIP trunk provider you use from a carrier perspective that you plug into that session border controller. So no real limitation there. As long as they're supported and they're aware of the particular session border controller that you're using and they have no issues using that, then that shouldn't be an issue. You can pretty much use anyone you want. Another question here, why would you use Telstra calling over direct routing? Seems you can have much better cost control with direct routing. It really depends on your circumstances and what you're looking to achieve. So there are pros and cons to both approach. We have organisations using both. So I think it really comes down to what is going to be right for your organisation. Another question here around delays. Is there a way to mitigate the delay that is present when making a call? E.g. when you place a call in Teams, it seems to take a few seconds. So it really depends on the infrastructure that's supporting it. So absolutely, there's things that we do and we deploy infrastructure to make sure that it's deployed in a way that limits latency. Latency is really the currency that we talk about when we do these kinds of solutions. So there's things that we do to kind of mitigate that. It's also important that you have the right SBC settings set so we can provide ringback tones and whatnot. So we don't really see many issues with call delays. I will say though that we are dealing with a cloud service, so it's not going to be as fast as a beige box on your wall that might be 10 years old. It's sitting right there. It will take a second or so for it to process. Okay, I'm going to push on. I haven't forgotten the rest of these questions. I will get back to these after the next little bit. Okay, calling features. So we've talked a lot about how we actually get voice into the cloud and how we actually can support that using two different methods. But what kind of calling features do I have in the cloud? So let's just start with a few. So the first couple, cloud auto attendance and call queues. So this is auto attendance as in press 1 for this, press 2 for that. Cloud call queues, if you come from telco standard PABX world, it's a hunt group, right? If you're coming from Sky for Business world, we had on-premises response groups. So call queues, auto attendance exists in the cloud today and allow us to do more advanced call routing, time of day routing, holiday sets. We can do voice recognition, a whole bunch of cool things. So I very rarely find a scenario that I can't map out with auto attendance and or call queues when we're moving a standard telephony platform across to Microsoft Teams Voice. We have cloud voicemail now. If you came from the Skype for Business world, you might be familiar with Exchange Unified Messaging. Exchange Unified Messaging is not used by Teams on the back end at all. We have this thing called cloud voicemail, has nothing to do with Exchange, makes it much easier. It's actually enabled by default when we enable someone for voice in Teams, and has some really great settings that are shown on this slide here. So I can actually, as an end user, go and record a greeting, or I can do text to speech if I'm at the airport about to go on holiday and I haven't got time, I can write those things in, or I can actually change the call answer rules and things like that. It's either on or off for my end users, and it is controllable with policy. So you can disable, enable it, or leave it at user controlled as an administrator, but you don't need to worry about Exchange Unified Messaging anymore. We can, of course, answer and initiate phone calls. Surprise. Music on hold, it's worth calling out. We got this relatively recently, so we have music on hold with Microsoft Teams calls now. We have call forwarding options, blind and consultative transfers when we want to move calls around. We can transfer to voicemail. Bottom right of that picture there, you'll see I can transfer directly to Patrick's work voicemail. If I can see that Patrick's busy or away, it's something I used to do. We used to do in Sky for Business all the time. That exists in Teams now. Similarly with simultaneous ring, that's something that we had in Sky for Business forever and a day. It's actually been in the Teams client for quite some time now, but simultaneous ring is there. Group call pickup and forward to group. So an alternative to call pickup groups is something called group call pickup in the Microsoft Teams world. So we do have that capability. We can park calls and retrieve calls. We have caller ID, as you would expect. Device switching, so if I'm in a call, I can switch between devices. I sometimes do that when I want to switch from my headset to a speaker puck, which is the device I'm talking to you on now. We have presence-based call routing with call queues now, which is quite nice. We can configure a secondary ringer from the client. We can have distinctive rings, so if someone calls for me versus a forwarded call versus a delegated call, we can get a different ringer, so we get an audio notification. We have shared line appearance. So that works in conjunction with the delegate setup. So I want to be a delegate for somebody else. I can see them in the top of my Teams client, excuse me, and I can actually see who they're on a call with. I can see they're on a call and I can see who they're actually talking to. The other thing I can do with shared line appearance is I can make calls outbound on someone's behalf. So if I'm a PA for somebody and I want to call out from them, I can actually call out on their behalf. It appears to come from their number. I can tell the person on the other end, I'm calling for such and such, I'll connect you now, and then connect that through to the manager, for example. We have busy on busy, a weird request we get sometimes where people don't want that second call toast. They want a engaged tone when someone else calls in if they're on the phone. Not something I see a lot of, but it does come up from time to time. And we have subscriber numbers in the cloud as well. So this is just it's probably an entire session to go through absolutely every single calling feature in detail. Just designed to be a bit of an overview of what calling features we have natively within Teams today. Okay, competition time. So I'm going to go through a few more questions. And while I am, if you want to scan that code, we will be having prize giveaway at the end of the week. So please get your phones out, scan the QR code. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go through some more questions. Okay, from Steve, do you know if the announcement of Optus MS Teams calling service is the same as what Telstra calling is? No, it's not the same. They are using carrier direct routing to do that. I only saw that announcement today. I'm going to make the assumption that it is direct routing because I don't think it could be anything else. So yes, I am 99.8% certain that it will be using carrier direct routing to offer that. Okay, next question. Using direct routing, what are the usual pain points in moving from traditional PBX, say Avaya, e.g. delays on picking up calls, call park abilities, limited IVR options? Okay, good question. So because of how we actually do the integration with the session border controller, and we also do some other stuff with AD integration so that we can actually route calls automatically to people that move to Teams and things like that. From a call delay perspective, we don't see any issues with call delays per se. If somebody is using kind of more advanced call center type capabilities on an existing platform, then yes, there might be some things that can be done on the existing PABX that we can't do natively in Teams today. There will be some things coming in the future that I'll touch on in a few more slides that will add additional capabilities from third-party contact center or call center organizations. So delays on picking up calls, I don't really see that. Call park, we have that in Teams. Limited IVR options, it depends what you mean by limited. We don't have things like, you know, letting people know your number X in the queue or a callback feature or anything like that. That's when we start to get more into the call center type environments. Another question here from Dave, can you use Telstra calling to migrate in the other direction? Move from an existing Telstra account to Telstra calling and then migrate to another provider? So from a migration perspective, your number ranges will be associated with a telco service. So whether it's associated with Telstra calling or an existing Telstra SIP Connect trunk or another carrier's trunk, that's just a porting that happens that allows you to move from one provider to another. So it doesn't really matter if it's Telstra calling or a SIP Connect trunk from Telstra or a trunk from somebody else. Assuming that you don't have contractual obligations, you want to move that number range, then you can move that between services. So between services within Telstra, so SIP Connect to Telstra calling or the other way around, or you could move to and from another provider altogether. Another question here from Andrew. Microsoft looking at providing their call plans into New Zealand/Australia at some point. In Australia, I would say no. I'd say that's going to stay as Telstra calling or Telstra offering that service. No plans that I'm aware of being direct. I think that's a Telstra service. As for New Zealand, I'm not sure. What I can say is there was an announcement a couple of days ago that New Zealand was getting its own region, so its own Microsoft data centers with Azure, Office 365, Dynamics, you know, the full gamut of services. So I don't know for New Zealand. Maybe they'll get calling plans, but if not, you could look in the meantime into Azure hosted direct routing with a carrier of your choice, knowing that they're going to have their own data centers at some point in the not too distant future. So that could be your backup plan. Okay. So during migration, how can a Skype user join a Teams call in the same company? Great question. So if you're doing point-to-point calls and we could go down a rabbit hole with this one because we get into different Teams interrupt modes with islands mode and Teams only modes and a whole bunch of other things. But basically there is a mechanism in Office 365 where if I've got some users that are still on Skype for Business and some users that are still on Teams, I can get phone calls and instant messages to route between the two platforms. Now I can't join a Teams meeting from a Skype for Business client and I can't join a Skype for Business and the other way around. But for point-to-point calls, assuming that I'm out of what we call islands mode and my users are in one of the other modes that are available, I do actually get interop between Skype for Business and Teams for instant message and phone calls. So if you want to know more about that after the session, please feel free to reach out. I can take you through how that works. Okay, so I'm going to leave the new questions that are there. I'm just going to finish up the slides and then we'll finish up with questions for as long as everyone wants to hang around. Okay, devices. Now, of course, we've talked about some features of the client and we've talked about how we actually get calls into the cloud, but we need devices if we're going to use Microsoft Teams for calling. So two main categories of devices. We have individual workspaces, so whether it's me at my desk or me on the road or wherever I happen to be. And then we have group workspaces. So that's our meeting rooms. It might be lecture theatres, might be a whole bunch of different things that we have. And we now have a pretty good range of devices that fit all of those categories. So from the smallest headset through to the largest kind of meeting room or Surface Hub, that kind of thing, we have a device that we can use with Microsoft Teams, including for voice. So a range of Teams devices. So all of them have the Teams experience, or particularly the new ones have the Teams experience, and we'll show you some of those in a sec. Certified hardware, we're going to touch on why that's important as well. And always ready, right? We actually have device update capabilities and monitoring from the cloud now, from the Office 365 portal for today for Teams phones and what we call collaboration bars. And we're going to see some more management options appear in that portal in the not too distant future as well for other types of devices. Now, very quickly, if we look at phones in particular, and we talk about where we came from there. I don't know if anyone on the event remembers those Tanjay phones, but they existed from 2007 to around 2010 with our Office Communication Service deployments. And then with Link 2010, we had what we knew at the time as Link Phone Edition or Aries phones. And these were Windows CE operating system devices that ran Microsoft code on top of them. But with Sky for Business, Microsoft kind of figured out at some point we're not very good at making phone code, at least not at that time. So they partnered with a bunch of organizations to make the phone and make the software, and then Microsoft would basically ratify those to register against their Sky for Business server or Sky for Business Online environment. This is what we knew as a third-party interoperability program, or 3PIP if you see that anywhere. That's what that means. So Microsoft didn't make the code, they don't make the phones, they just say, yes, I'm going to bless this phone to be used with Sky for Business environment. So that was okay at the time, but what ended up happening was Microsoft would change the way Skype worked, or they'd add a codec, or they would tweak something, and there'd be a lag. There'd be an amount of time for the third-party vendors to actually update their software in order to take that change into account, or there could have actually been a hardware limitation that stopped them being able to do it. So coming full circle now to Teams, we're now actually back to a model where Microsoft actually owns the code that runs on these phones that come from vendors, okay? So with the Microsoft Teams phones, they actually run Android OS, believe it or not, under the hood, and then they run Microsoft Teams client on top of it. The main advantage of this, particularly if we take into account, software as a service, evergreen, changes all the time, this kind of world we live in now, this now means that as Microsoft innovates and adds new features to Microsoft Teams, the phones get those features straight away. So for example, last week, my little Yealink T55 phone here, which is a Teams certified phone, it got new firmware from the Microsoft Cloud, and now I have presets for my favorite users, right, as appeared on the device. So they didn't have to ask, Yealink or Polycom or anyone else to, Poly, I should say, in order for that change to come out. They were able to innovate and get that improved experience out, and we keep moving forward. So today, this is a pretty good range of all the types of devices that are Teams certified. So we've got Poly's latest CCX range up the top there. We have devices from Yealink, Crestron, audio codes. So there's a few phones out there. But key takeaway, they are all running Android OS with Microsoft Teams code over the top. Okay, just a little side here about the last meter. So often I talk to individuals at organizations or whatnot that, I've had a bad experience with a Teams call or a Teams meeting or something like that. And I just want to call out that it's often overlooked, that last device, or as I refer to, the last meter, is really important. We need to be using certified devices. And it's not a sales pitch, right? You need to be using a device that is certified for use for Teams, that has things like noise block technology, the right drivers, plug and play capabilities. It's also important to define user personas and equip people with the right device. So if I'm a road warrior, if I'm a salesperson that's out of the office all the time, it doesn't make sense that I get a decked headset that will never pair with my mobile, that would only work in the office with a base station. No, it probably makes sense that I get a Bluetooth headset with some noise cancelling capabilities when I'm working in all the cafes in order for me to do my job. So definitely look at user personas. We want to understand the space in which we work. There's a difference between me working in my office, in my own little space where I can have a speakerphone if I really want to, versus an open plan office where I've got a lot of noise happening around me. Do I want 1-ear or 2-ear headphones? Do I want noise cancellation? All those types of things. And if your device comes as a unified communications Teams certified device, they usually come with a dongle like this if they're a wireless Bluetooth device. Use that dongle. Don't connect directly to the Bluetooth on your device because it's not as good. These devices have much better Bluetooth capabilities, and they also have additional capabilities in the software that they come with in order to improve the experience. Okay. So in that vein, we do have a concept of Microsoft Teams certified devices. If you go to that aka.ms link, you can go and find more details on what's supported. But these do get updated pretty regularly. We've seen a bunch of new devices released recently as well. Something else you might start to see is an actual Teams button start to appear on devices. So I'm actually speaking to you today from a Sennheiser speakerphone that's sitting in front of me. It actually has a Teams button on it. What does that do? So if I hit that Teams button and my Teams client wasn't in the foreground, it'll bring that Teams client to the foreground. It'll also flash if I've got voicemail and things like that. And there's going to be additional capabilities that are added to these. So it's not just there for looks. That Teams blurple color button that's there will have other uses as we go through. So you're also going to start to see that kind of logo pop up and the Teams blurple color on a bunch of other devices as well. So keep an eye out for that. Teams certified speakerphones. So again, I'm talking to you on one of these right now, the Sennheiser, but they all have, if you look really closely, they all have little Teams buttons on them, which you can see there and there. So again, look out for those devices coming out as well. So headsets built for any environment. Again, to what I was saying earlier about matching the headset to the type of worker. Is someone in an open office? Are they on the go, or are they just at their desk? Map that right device to the user. Here's a little bit of a close-up on some of the Microsoft Teams phones. So you can see at the bottom there the Poly bracket com devices and the Yealink device at the top. One key difference between the Yealink and the Polys is that the Polys don't have any buttons. They've got a few, but they don't have a dial pad and whatnot. It's all touchscreen, whereas the Yealinks have a touchscreen and some buttons on them. And Crestron's got that video phone that is coming out soon, I believe. Excuse me. Okay, so what about my existing 3-pip phones? So earlier I talked about the 3-pip phones that we might have used with Link and Skype for Business. What happens to those if I want to move to Teams Voice? So for Skype for Business Online customers who move to Teams, you can continue to use those 3-pip phones until July 31st, 2023. However, there are limitations. So the first one is, of course, they're not a native Teams device. What Microsoft have done is they've deployed a SIP gateway at the edge of Teams that these phones are able to connect through in order to continue to use them until that cutoff date in 2023. Because we're using this, or Microsoft is using this method, it does mean that we're not going to have the same capability as I would get from a native Teams phone. So for example, some of the limitations we've hit with these phones, we've had some issues with answering call queue calls on these devices. That's one example. If you're using these devices at the end of hallways, as a help point phone or something like that, they're fine to use as a Teams phone up until that July 31st, 2023. But after that, you are going to want to look at replacing them with Teams native devices. Just keep that in mind. For our meeting rooms, for audio-only meeting rooms, we have a bunch of devices that we can use. These are the three more common. So the Poly Trio in the middle there, the 8800. We have the Crestron off to the left there, and we have the A-Link version on the side on the right. All of these are running the Teams code on them. So for those that might have Poly Trios today and you're using them for video as well, I can't use that as a native Teams video device, but I can use it as an audio-only phone. So if you have Poly Trio devices being used for audio-only mode today with Skype for Business or maybe some other platform, you can actually install the Teams software on them and they will run the native Teams code. And just a little bit of licensing for the meeting room devices. So, of course, as you'd expect, we need a license if we're going to have a phone system on devices, just like we do for our users. For common area phones, and let's define common area phones as devices that don't have video. So those phones I showed you before are common area phones. If I have a standard handset in a room that's not associated to a user, but it's associated to the room, that's a common area phone. There is a license for common area phones. It includes Skype for Business, Microsoft Teams, and phone system licensing on it. Skype for Business for backwards compatibility, and Microsoft Teams and phone system is what you would need for Teams calling. Of course, if I was using Telstra calling, I'd also need a calling plan on top of that, or I'd need direct routing configured somewhere if I wanted to use it. But that's what I need for a common area phone. For Teams meeting rooms, and define a Teams meeting room as a meeting room with video. So if I've got a Surface Hub or a Microsoft Teams room system that is a native Teams video conferencing capable device, I need the Teams meeting room license. So it has those first three bits of license that we had on the common area phone, but we also have two more, audio conferencing and Microsoft Intune. So Intune is used to manage those devices, and audio conferencing is actually used a very small use case, but if I want to go into a meeting room and hit meet now, basically create a meeting, and then I want to check the meeting entry info from the screen and then tell someone the phone number to dial into my conference, the device needs to have audio conference license. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, just a little bit on the user account based experiences. So with the phones, we actually have the ability now to change what's displayed on the screen by default, depending on where that device is used. So if I'm a user sitting at a desk and I'm lucky enough to have my own Teams phone, I have the user UI on the left here. And it shows my users and I can click a button to make a phone call and do all those types of things. That view doesn't make a lot of sense in a meeting room. So if I have a phone in a meeting room, say a Poly Trio audio-only device, I don't need to see users, I need to see the meetings that are scheduled and a dial pad button. And I can now do that from the back end when I deploy these systems. Similarly, if I'm doing a common area phone, a phone in a hallway or something like that, I don't need to see meetings. I just need to see a dial pad, right? So I just walk up, dial a number, make a phone call. Okay, to round out, what's coming? So we've looked at a lot of the features that Teams has, but what's around the corner? So the first one that's great to see is we're going to have compliance recording for Microsoft Teams landing pretty soon. And what that means is that Microsoft have partnered up with a bunch of compliance or recording partners in order to record natively from the cloud. So that's currently in preview at the moment, and we expect that to go live pretty soon. But basically it means we don't have to have any on-premises infrastructure, and I can do compliance recording for my Microsoft Teams environment that's all controlled with policy. So I can control whose calls are recorded, whose calls aren't. I can record internal Teams-to-Teams calls as well. I can record conferences as part of compliance recording. All this stuff is coming. And they're the partners along the bottom that Microsoft has partnered with. What else is coming? Contact Center for Microsoft Teams. So we're in the early phases at the moment. We're seeing some kind of initial contact center integration, actually using direct routing, where we route calls between a contact center and Teams. But we're also expecting to see a phase 2, where we see more kind of tight application integration between call center providers and Teams. We're not quite there yet. It is coming along. Here's an example of 3 partners that are working on that: Enghouse Interactive, Landers Contact Center, and Anywhere 365. But I think this is going to be an area where we're going to see a lot of movement over the next few months, I would expect. And lastly here, what's coming? Better Together over Bluetooth. So if any of you had Better Together with the old Link phones, or Better Together over Ethernet with, say, Poly phones or something like that, there is this concept of Better Together over Bluetooth, where I still control a phone call that's happening on a desk phone from my Teams client, and Microsoft is doing that over Bluetooth. That's something else to look out for. So in summary, why Microsoft Teams calling? Consistent experience. Telephony features are here today with Microsoft Teams. We can do telephony with Teams. We've got lots of organizations that are doing it. It delivers the latest innovations. Telstra calling plans, if that's the option you go for, allow you to quickly deploy dial tone to users. We have direct routing to give you a little bit more flexibility in your environments. And we also, of course, everything that Microsoft does in the Teams space, it adheres to enterprise-grade security, compliance, and manageability with Office 365. Okay, so it's going to fit into the model. And just a reminder for everyone, Skype for Business Online will be retired July 31st, 2021. So if you're using Skype for Business Online today and you haven't planned to move to Teams, including your voice, if you're using Skype for Business Online with voice, you really need to start planning for this. It's going to come around pretty quick. Okay, with that, I'm going to get through a few more questions. We've just gone over a couple of minutes, but anyone wants to hang around, I'm going to go and answer any of the questions that are left here. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them my way. Okay, let's have a look. Okay. Question from Eric. How complex is it to move a PSTN SIP trunk from an on-premises SBC to a cloud-hosted SBC? So it really depends on your SIP trunk provider and how they can route to the cloud. So if they do SIP trunks over the internet, which a lot of providers do, you can just do it over the internet. They update the IP address that it's hitting, and it hits that SBC in the cloud. If they don't do it over the internet, then it can be a little bit more complicated. It depends on what you have deployed from a network perspective, what you have in Azure, whether you can route to Azure from your internal network, all those types of things. So it's difficult to give you the full answer without knowing a little bit more. But do reach out if you would like to take me through it in a little bit more detail. All right. A question from Nikki, what about reporting on calls? Yes, something I didn't cover off in this session was reporting. So there is analytics in the Office 365 portal for reporting on calls. I can actually, with direct routing, export every single call that's ever been made on my via direct routing. And we now have things like call quality dashboard views with Power BI, where we can actually get some pretty cool dashboards up that show us a lot more detail. So yes, reporting is there in Office 365, and we can do even more with Power BI as well. Okay. Okay, I've got time for maybe one more question. Let's have a look. Okay, one question here from Hayden. What is the end user experience in terms of a customer receiving a call? Do we have registered names, e.g. Dave or Contoso, appearing to verify the business? So Teams can do reverse number lookup. So if that number exists in Active Directory or in a directory somewhere, we can actually match that to a name. And for example, in one of those screen grabs that I had earlier on, that inbound call that had my name on it, it was because my mobile number was in Active Directory. So you were able to see that. And with that, I know there's a few more questions there, but we have run out of time. Thanks everybody for jumping on today and staying with me for an hour and 5 minutes. If you have any other follow-up questions or would like any more information, please do feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, anything like that. Thank you, everybody.